Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Arik Verma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the final week of the course. During the last two lectures, I have talked to you about various aspects of development. In the first lecture, I talked to you about the biological aspects that affect human development, the role of the heredity, genes, prenatal influences, and so on and so forth. In the last lecture, I talked to you about the initial abilities that a young one is born with, abilities relating to vision, hearing, taste, smell, motor abilities, and so on and so forth. We also talked to you about various theories of cognitive development. We talked to you about at length about Piaget's theory of development. We talked to you about information processing theories, knowledge acquisition theories, socio-cultural theories, all of these various perspectives that look at how the cognitive development of the child really happens. In today's lecture, I will try and take this talk about development to a slightly different direction. I will talk to you about some of the interesting aspects. Remember, this course is Advanced Cognitive Processes. Some of the higher abilities, some of the higher functions that children and adults deal with, how the development of these kind of things happen. So let us take this slightly further. One of the things that I mentioned when I was talking about Piaget's theory of concrete operations, if I am right, was this aspect of egocentric thinking. Children, when they are very young, they cannot appreciate what others are thinking, they cannot appreciate the other perspective. That basically is a very interesting thing, because part of being an adult basically involves doing this exactly. Part of being an adult involves understanding other people's mind. What is this person thinking about, what is their expectations, what are their beliefs and assumptions, and so on and so forth. And this is something that that influences our behavior a lot. This is something that tells us how to behave in a particular, how to behave with a particular person in a particular manner. Suppose, for example, you come back from school and you find you have something to say to your father, but you notice that he is not really in a very good mood. Now, is that the time that you will go and ask for raise in pocket money or something like that, something that that he is really not going to be very happy about? As adults, we kind of tackle around these problems very well. We notice what is a good time to tell somebody something, what is a good time to react in a particular manner to this particular person. So when this ability is not something that also suddenly really happens. I very much appreciate this idea of looking at development as a continuum and not really as stages where one stage ends and something else kind of happens almost out of nowhere. So this is something that the child has to learn. The children have to grasp this, and they have to you will see that children, when they are younger, they are not really very mindful of what others are thinking. Suppose, for example, if they are stuck on asking for something, if they are kind of stuck on being stubborn about some particular thing, and they are being kind of very they are kind of being very picky, and they are kind of being very finicky and stuff. These things kind of get lesser and lesser as the child grows up. And earlier, when these things will be happening, irrespective of whatever the mood of the parent is, you will see that even if children have to be stubborn and they have to be asked about something incessantly, they will wait for the right time. They will automatically grasp that, okay, today it's not a great time to talk to the father, it's not a great thing to talk to the mother about. And these things also, they are developing. So when you're talking about cognitive development, when you're talking about overall development of an individual, these are also skills that you should look at, we should look at actually, at how is the development of these skills happening. Part of all of what I was just talking about comes under this bigger concept of theory of mind. Another term for this is this aspect of metacognition. We occasionally reflect on our thinking process as well by evaluating what we would do in a particular situation, or wondering how we could have been believing in something that was not correct. So we are also looking at ourselves in some sense. So that is referred to as metacognition. So these two things, metacognition and theory of mind, and they are kind of very related concepts, is also, I mean, psychologists have been interested in looking at how are these theories developing. How does the child start appreciating somebody else's point of view, perspective, so on and so forth. So researchers basically have attempted to study the child's knowledge about these basic mental states such as desires, percepts, beliefs, knowledge, thoughts, intentions, feelings, etc. And they have been doing this by devising very innovative experiments, very highly ingenious experiments. One of the experiments, in one of a very interesting experiment, basically an experimenter basically he is holding a box, and this candy box has pictures of candy on it, and then he shows this box to this 5-year-old kid, and he asks the kid that, okay, what does this box contain? And the kid basically looks at the box, and he just says that, okay, that box must contain candy. Now the interesting thing happens, when the after the answer is got, the child is asked to look inside the box, and to the child's surprise, the child discovers that, okay, the box has crayons instead of candy. Now then the experimenter asks, okay, now you know that there is crayons here but not candy. How do you think the other person, this other friend of yours, who I have not really shown what is inside here, what would he think that is there in this box? So the child answers, candy. Now what happens is, so I mean, just hold on with this one. Now what happens is, the experimenter tries the same procedure with a 3-year-old kid. So the first first 2 questions have been asked to 5-year-old kids. Now what the experimenter does is, okay, let me do this with a 3-year-old kid. Same question, same kind of procedure. The first answer is again candy, but when you ask the child that the second question, what will the other person think that is there in this thing, now that you know that there are crayons? So the child kind of answers that, no, I think the other person will also think that there are crayons. What is happening here? If you kind of pause it and think here, what is happening is that the preschooler, the 3-year-old child, has not really developed this ability to fully understand that other people also have minds and thoughts which are different from their own, because the child was shown the crayon, and the child kind of now cannot really check whether it's not conscious of the fact that the other person has not really seen that there are crayons here, and they will think based on the picture and based on the box that it is candy here. Because the child knows that now I know that there are crayons here, the child also believes that the other person also knows that there are crayons in this box. So this is something the child needs to grasp, and the child needs to develop and master over the course of time. So Bosch and Velma, basically they did this experiment in 1995. They basically argued that the developmental sequence of things like metacognition theory of mind basically has 3 steps. What are the 3 steps? About around the age of 2 years, children have an elementary conception of simple desires, emotions and perceptual experiences. Okay, so they basically know that, okay, people have simple desires like I want to have milk, I want to have sweet, etc., etc. They have a very rudimentary understanding of emotions. For them, as I was saying earlier, if a desired outcome is there, I am happy. If an undesired outcome is there, I am not happy, something like that. Okay, so they have a very rudimentary understanding of both desires and emotions and perceptual experiences. They understand that people can have wants, and they can be afraid of things, they can like things and they can not like things, but they don't really appreciate the fact that people mentally also represent both objects and their own desires and beliefs. So these things are not really well drafted out in their brain. In the second stage, which is around 3 years of age, children begin to talk about beliefs and thoughts as well as desires. So they kind of now start talking about that reality is something else, desire is something else, but there are beliefs as well. Somebody can think and in a slightly more abstract fashion as well. And at this stage, they seem to understand that beliefs can be false as well as true. So they now are beginning to grasp these higher order kind of activities, and they also start appreciating that beliefs can differ from people to people. Different people can have different sets of beliefs. Finally, at around the age of 4, children begin to understand people's thoughts and beliefs, affect their behaviors, and that people can have beliefs that do not affect reality, that do not reflect reality. So the idea is they start, thinking in terms of that, other people can have different kinds of thoughts, other people can have different kinds of beliefs, and different people believe in different ways because of their own thoughts and beliefs, which might not be exactly the same thoughts and beliefs that that I am having for that matter as a child. So these are the 3 stages in which this the aspect of development of theory of mind has been captured and has been proposed. Now, one of the major implications, one of the major applications, let us say, of the theory of mind research is in understanding the experiences of autistic individuals. Now, you might have heard of autism. It's a serious disorder in which children seem unresponsive, to others, and they tend to have a significant problem in communicating with others, building social, relationships and those kind of things. One of the very characteristic things is that these children seem very little interested in interacting or socially communicating with individuals. Say for example, they might not really be emotionally very expressive. They will not smile back at you if you smile at them, and those kind of things. Now, Simon Baron Cohen basically suggested that autistic kids might be lacking this fundamental theory of mind, this understanding of what the others are feeling, or say for example this aspect of metacognition, about reflecting about their own thought processes and stuff, which might be preventing them from understanding others' feelings, desires and beliefs as well. So this can be one of the major symptoms or factors in people who are in children who are suffering from autism. Now, because this fundamental theory of mind is absent, people can seem like any other object to these autistic children. It's just like a table, so a person is just equivalent to a table or a chair and does not really need an emotional interaction to develop a bond. Leading to these children being very less interested in others or in different kinds of social interactions. So this is again one of the very interesting aspects, a higher order ability that children develop over the course of their life. Another higher order ability that children tend to develop gradually is this sense of moral judgment. So Piaget was not only interested in cognitive development, but he was also interested in children's moral judgment as well. How does the child appreciate good and bad? How does the child differentiate from what is right and what is wrong? Their understanding of moral rules. What is right? Is there an absolute thing that is right or wrong, or these are social conventions? There are ways in which societies expect you to behave. There are conventions that we follow. So Piaget he basically believed that the overall level of cognitive development, the children's overall level of cognitive development will basically determine their moral judgment as well. So it's a bit like saying that people in the formal operational stage have better moral understanding as compared to children who are in the concrete or pre-operational stages as well. So those kind of things. Now, on the basis of the observations that Piaget made, he used to observe a lot of kids and spend a lot of time with them, observing their minute activities. So, on the basis of the observations that Piaget made, he proposed that children's understandings of rules develops in 4 stages. Now, before I really start talking about this, rules are a good way of appropriating the sense of moral judgment, but they might not be, they might not really reflect the more richer sense of morals. But again, we are talking about children's development, so this we can use this as a reference to talk about. Now, the first stage Piaget suggests is happens around the pre-operational period, wherein the child follows a set of private idiosyncratic rules. I like this seems right to me, I will do this. Okay, those kind of things. Say for example, and by this stage children also start looking at the environment in terms of features and categories. So if you ask this child to sort play items using color or size or shape, they might be able to do it. So there is a certain degree of of cognitive development which is leading to follow a particular kind of a moral development. It's not really a very close link, by the way. In the second stage, which is happening around 5 years, the child develops a sense of obligation to follow rules. Given the kind of environment and society children are brought up in, the child starts to think that this is a rule and this must be followed. Okay, the child starts treating these rules as absolute moral imperatives handed down by some authority. So my mother has said this, I will follow this verbatim and on 100 times out of 100, or my teacher has told me that this has to happen and I have to follow this 100 times out of 100. So this is so their understanding of rules is rigid in some sense, but it kind of reflects a degree of a lack of understanding as well. I mean, we can kind of we might be mixing this some things up here. Now in the third stage, children begin to appreciate that rules, some rules for that matter, are just social conventions. They are cooperative agreements that can be arbitrarily changed if everyone agrees. Suppose for example, parents tell their children to share stuff. Now till a particular time the child will blindly obey that, my mother has said that I have to share things and I should share things irrespective of whatever is happening. By a certain age, the child starts appreciating the fact that it is just a suggestion that if two people are agreed, they have to share, but the child will also start appreciating the fact that you cannot share at a given point if you don't like the person, if the person is not sharing back, those kind of things. Okay, so children start realizing that rules are just social conventions made by people and are changeable, can be worked around with. Okay, their moral realism also declines. Earlier, rules are treated as permanent and not subjected to modification in the second stage. By this stage, their moral realism also kind of starts declining. They will start taking into account other and more sophisticated, more richer factors. For example, their moral, they will when talking about moral judgments, when talking about deciding punishments as well, etc. Children in this stage start taking into account things like intentions, and the consequences and those kind of stuff. For example, in the second stage, if somebody has broken a rule, he deserves a punishment. You spoke in the class, you broke something, you're not supposed to break this, so now that you've broken this, you have to get this quantum of punishment. Again, that's kind of given by sources of authority. By this third stage, what Piaget says is that children start taking into account things like, okay, he did not intend to break it, so he does not deserve the punishment even though something is broken and the rule is violated. So this is how basically this is really panning out. Now the final and the fourth stage, youngsters start showing an interest. Now I am talking about adolescents and young adults by this time. Youngsters start showing an interest in generating rules to deal with situations they have never encountered. Okay, so they have kind of now figured out how the moral thing of how the moral fabric of the word is working, and they kind of also generating rules and principles for sometimes situations that they have not really encountered themselves even. This stage is characterized by an ideological code of moral reasoning. I believe in these ideals and my reasoning would work according to these ideals. Okay, addressing wider social issues, say for example, people should be kind to everybody, you should not treat animals badly, all those kind of things, and these broad ideological codes start showing in and this youngsters start using them in their personal and interpersonal situations very liberally across the board. Suppose, say for example, a young adult is smitten by a particular kind of ideology, or they start following a particular kind of idol, then those kind of things they will start appropriating in different situations. Now there are other theories of moral development as well. For example, Kohlberg has done a lot of work on moral development in children, and he basically extends the work by Piaget. Typically what he did was he started giving children moral dilemmas to solve. We've talked about personal moral dilemmas earlier. He would give problems to children. Say for example, if there is a child whose mother is sick, and the child goes to the medicine shop, he does not really have enough money to buy the medicine, so the child steals the medicine, brings that and brings that medicine and gives it to his mother. Now has he done a right thing or a wrong thing? If I ask this question to children of different ages, I would expect to get a different kind of response. And on the basis of the kind of response that is got, Kohlberg divided the development of children or development of moral reasoning into 3 levels, which have kind of 6 stages. So I will not really go into a lot of detail, but I will just tell you how the 3 levels work. So the first level is pre-conventional morality. So pre-conventional morality is basically characterized by orientation towards punishment. You obey rule to avoid punishment, you disobey, as soon as you disobey you deserve a punishment, things like that. The second stage is that orientation has to be rewarding. People conform to particular kinds of instruction, to particular kinds of modes of thought to obtain rewards and to have favors returned. Say for example, if I believe this, if I agree with you here, I expect you to agree to me at a different point in time. Then comes conventional morality. Conventional morality basically has this good boy, good girl kind of orientation. If I follow this moral code, I will be considered as a good boy by my teachers, by my parents, by my friends, etc., etc. Okay, so the child is basically confirming, he is not really understanding the moral code as yet, but he is just confirming that okay, if I have 6 ticks in these columns, then I am considered a good boy, and I will take every effort to not tick any of these columns. So this is something. And the fourth stage here, which is part of the second level, basically is about authority orientation. So the children will basically, or this stage basically talks about upholding laws and social rules to avoid censure of the authorities, and feelings of guilt about not doing one's duty are also can be experienced. So I am doing whatever I am doing because my father has said this. If I don't do it, then I will probably be in trouble, or if I am doing this because my teachers have said this, my school principal has said this, if I am not doing this, I might land up with punishment. So this is the pre-conventional morality, and then is the conventional morality, which generally the society kind of tends to follow at large. Now the third is the post-conventional morality, and this is when you are talking about when children have achieved a certain degree of motivation, certain degree of maturity. So then they kind of start looking at things as the social contract orientation is there. Actions are guided by principles commonly agreed on as essential to the public welfare, and these principles are basically upheld to retain the respect of peers and thus also self-respect. So now you are doing something. Now you are not hurting animals, because it is not like somebody will punish you, but it is because you want to be seen as a kind person. So you are aspiring to that a personal goal of kindness, and that is why you are not doing it. Nobody is forcing, there is nobody looking at you, there is no punishment reward looming on your head, but the fact is you are doing certain things so that you kind of obey a sort of a social contract, and the social contract is basically something that is in the larger good of the society. So those kind of things. Finally, there is this ethical principle orientation, again kind of there are things that are overlapping here. Actions guided by self-chosen ethical principles, which usually value justice, dignity, equality, and the principles are held to avoid self-condemnation. I will feel very bad if I don't do it. I will feel have this code of conduct. Suppose, or say for example, people start looking at themselves as having X, Y, Z characteristics. This is my code of conduct. This is what I think should be done. This is what I think should not be done. My personal code of conduct says I should not teach. I should not cheat. I should not lie. I should not hurt others. So whatever I am going to do is going to be governed by this set of rules. So personal. So self condemnation needs to be avoided. So these are the 3 kinds of morality. This is basically the progression given, and again I am not really saying that strict age wise rule kind of needs to follow this, but this is how the development of moral reasoning might happen as far as Kohlberg is concerned. So Kohlberg basically believed that individual develops with age across these 3 stages. Now let us talk to a different aspect of development. We have talked about moral development, moral metacognition, theory of mind, and moral judgment. Let us talk a little bit about the emotional development part of the individual. Now emotional development basically also has aspects of nature and nurture. One of these aspects that is more biologically predetermined is this aspect of temperament. Now temperament basically refers to individual differences in attention, in arousal and reactivity to new or novel situations. Okay, so these differences basically start appearing very early when the child is just born, and they are relatively stable and they are long lasting. Suppose for example there is a finicky child, very unhappy, very difficult to handle child, it's highly probable that part of these characteristics will continue throughout the child's life. Okay, so this is the biological aspect of emotional development. Thomas and Chess 1997, they divided infants into 4 categories based on temperament rating. So they could measure temperament. They could say that 4 kinds of temperaments can be observed. Let me just very quickly tell you about them. Easy babies are happy and cheerful babies. They have regular sleeping and eating habits. They adapt very quickly to new situations, and they basically form around 40% of the sample. Now again, I am talking about the sample. Sample is US based. Okay, so these studies are basically conducted in the US. This is about 40% of the sample that they have in mind. There are slow to warm up babies who are, who take some time before they will be comfortable with you. Okay, so about 15% of the sample, they are slightly more withdrawn, they are very moody, and they tend to take a long time to adapt to new situations. So this is the second kind. Then there is this difficult babies. It's just around 10% of the sample, but they're very fussy, they're fearful of new situations, they'll not really react to strangers nicely, and they are very intense in their reactions. If they are crying, they're crying too loudly, they're crying very intensely, and those kind of things. Now one of the other things, it's not really a category, is that some babies do not fit to any of these categories. This is, by the way, a large number. It's around 35% of the entire sample, which will have a variety of traits, and they will share all of these traits from the other 3 categories. So there are 4 kinds of situations here, 4 categories you can imagine, and these are the 4 categories in which you can broadly divide a particular sample of children. So yeah, children can differ in their temperament. Now researchers have concluded that majority of infants develop distinct temperaments very early, usually in the first 2 to 3 months of life, and that these temperaments, they occur largely because of genetic factors rather than learning experiences. Because you start measuring temperament, because you start talking about temperament even just at the time when the child is born. You can just you can just see and observe that this child is going to be very tricky to handle. This child starts crying as soon as he is separated from his mother. This child is slightly fussy about particular habits. He has irregular sleeping and eating habits. These are the things that you can start make out already by the time that the child is born, and so researchers have concluded that this has to be more of a biological trait, biological characteristic, rather than something that the child has learned from the environment, learned from the parents or siblings or peers. Now, so while about 10 to 15% of Caucasian babies inherit a fearful temperament, about 40% of Caucasian babies inherit a fearless temperament. So again, the distribution could be very different across different kinds of population. Now, emotional development basically has to be an interaction between the temperament, that is the nature part of the thing, how is the general temperament or nature of the child, versus positive and negative environmental feedback. How are the parents reacting to the temperament of the child? Suppose there is a child who is born with a very happy temperament, but the parents are really not reacting to the child in a consistent manner. They are not really treating the child well. The emotional bond is not being formed. They are giving irregular punishments to the child. They are not taking care of the child. Then this child who was born with a happy temperament as well will develop problems. Will develop problems later in the thing, and they will become develop to be more irritable, fussy, and so on and so forth. And same can be done vice versa as well. Even if the child has a very fussy temperament, but if the child is brought up well and the parents have taken care of having the child very comfortable, inculcating that kind of confidence and trust in the child, encouraging the child to do his own things, then maybe that part that initial temperament factor can be kind of slightly moderated or nullified in some sense. So emotional development has to be a combination of the nature and the nurture parts. We'll kind of talk about this a bit more now. One of the other aspects very early in the child's lifespan is the kind of attachment that the child develops to the immediate caregivers, parents, and people around the child. Attachment basically refers to a very close, a very fundamental emotional bond that the child develops with his or her parents or caregivers. And attachment basically, kind of or absence of attachment, or you can actually look at the kind of attachment by measuring a particular concept called separation anxiety. Separation anxiety is basically measured by the amount of problem that the child has with respect to say for example, if the child is separated from the caregivers. If suppose the mother is bringing the child up, and the mother is always there for the child, is constantly around the child to help him, making feel secure and confident and everything, but as soon as the mother goes, the child starts crying. The degree of distress that the child will feel when being separated from the immediate caregiver is going to give you a bit of a measure of what separation anxiety is. Now, there could be different kinds of attachment patterns that the children might display. The first is secure attachment. So, secure attachment is basically characteristic of infants who use their parents as a safe home, as a safe base from which they can wander off and explore their environment. So, the child is kind of confident that the mother or the father will take care of the child, and because they are here, they are somewhere around, and I have this feeling that they are looking over me, I will explore the environment, be very confident because I know nothing bad is going to happen, explore the environment and come back. Insecure attachment is its characteristic of infants who avoid or show ambivalence or resistance towards their parents. Now, if the parents' behavior is not consistent, if it is not confidence inspiring, if the child has not really been able to trust the parent very much, then the children will show insecure attachment, and then the separation anxiety would also be differently manifested. So, these are some of the things about emotional development. Let us talk a little bit about social development. Now, social development, when I am talking to you, is basically social development refers to how a person develops a sense of self or identity. See, individuals do not come into this world all alone, and this world does not leave them alone as well. So, the child is immediately surrounded with immediate caregivers. They keep telling the child something, you do this, you do that, and they kind of interact or they kind of react to how the child is developing. They say if the child is doing a lot of good things, they encourage the child, praise the child. If the child is doing a lot of bad things, they reprimand the child, they scold the child, they react accordingly. Given this interaction between the biology and the environment, a person develops a sense of self or identity. I am this person, this is what my moral code is, this is what my ideological code is, this is what I should do, these are my abilities, this is what I want to become. All those kind of things, all of this kind of gets included in the development of self or identity. The relationship that the person is going to have with others, friends, peers, parents, and the kind of social skills that the person is going to develop. All of these personal interactions, all of this forms the social development thing. I am going to talk about a few theories of social development. One of the very dominant old popular theories of social development was put forward by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud basically talks about development, social development in terms of psychosexual stages. So, psychosexual stages is basically that because Freud believed that the social development has a lot to do with the sexual development of the child, and the sexual development of the child has consequences for the psychological characteristics or the psychological makeup of the child. So, that is the link he is trying to make. The psychosexual stages are 5 different developmental periods during which the individual seeks pleasure from different areas of the body that are associated with sexual feelings, and this interaction that ends up accumulating the social and personality development aspects of the child. Suppose the first stage is the oral stage. First 18 months of life, pleasure seeking zone is centered around the mouth. If the child does not receive adequate gratification in this period, adequate pleasure is not gained, then the child tends to get fixated in this period, and say for example, again Freud kind of goes on to say that these people will tend to become smokers later. Again, I do not really attach a lot of scientific importance to these things, but again this is theory which has been given, is one of the dominant theories, so we can talk about it a little bit. Anal stage, 18 to 16 months of age, pleasure zone is centered around the anus, and it basically has to do with the functions of elimination. Freud says if toilet training etc. is not done properly, if the conflict at this stage is not resolved properly, children would tend to develop particular kinds of personality, obsessive traits and those kind of things. Then there is phallic stage, 36 to 72 months, pleasure seeking zone is around the genitals, things like the electra complex, Oedipus complex are kind of here, that the child is competing with the parents of the same sex. That kind of conflict is there, and the way these conflicts are resolved will have a great bearing on how the child turns out to be. Then you have the latency period, 72 months to puberty, when a time when the child represses sexual thoughts and engages in non-sexual activities, looking out, making friends, developing social intellectual skills. Finally is the genital stage. From puberty onwards through adulthood is a time when the individual has renewed interest in sexual desires that he or she seeks to fulfill by forming relationships with members of the opposite sex. So this is the progression of what of the stages, psychosexual stages, that Freud gave. Let us move to the psychosocial stages. Erikson basically came up with this idea of 8 developmental periods during which the child's individual's primary goal is to satisfy desires that are associated with social needs. These 8 periods are kind of they are centered around these competing qualities. So I am just going to talk about them. So stage 1 is trust versus mistrust. It's around the early infant age. An infant basically to begin with needs much care and attention. If parents are sensitive and caring, the infant will develop what is called basic trust, which will make it easier for him or her to trust people later in life. Okay. If parents neglect the child, if they are inconsistent, he or she may view the world as uncaring and learn to become mistrustful and have that sort of bitterness later in his personality. Autonomy versus shame. 1 to 3 years of age, if the parents encourage the child to go out and play and explore, if the child is encouraged and made more confident, he will develop a sense of independence and autonomy. That's very important. And if not, then the child will develop a lot of shame, doubt, self-loathing, and again this is not going to turn out in a good personality trait for the child. Then there is initiative versus guilt. 3 to 5 years of age, if the parents are encouraging initiative, suppose the child goes on and makes new things or breaks a lot of things, but he is looking for something, he is trying to do something new, the child needs to be encouraged at this time. If the child is if the parents encourage this kind of initiative taking, the children will develop the ability to plan and initiate new things. Children need to be given this feedback, okay, you are on the right path, don't worry if something bad has happened, we will take care of this, but you do whatever you are interested in. Now, if parents become very fussy and they discourage the initiative that the child has to take, then it will kind of seed in feelings of guilt in the child, and the child will not be confident enough to plan the future and these kind of things. Industry versus inferiority is the 4th stage, 5 to 12 years of age. If the child can develop her energy to completing tasks and working through assignments, he or she will develop this feeling of industry and competence. You will see children around 5 to 12 years of age, they come up with random missions that they have to complete. They will spend in a lot of time and energy completing those kind of missions, and parents have to be supportive that of these kind of things. They should not really tell the child, don't do this, this is very dangerous, don't play with these people, don't do, all those kind of things have to be kind of held back. Because if the child starts having this difficulty in applying her abilities in completing tasks, things like homeworks, making something, projects, he or she will start developing feelings of inferiority. So here is the stage where the parent needs to help and compliment the child in whatever efforts he is taking, whatever goals, mini goals that the child is setting, and that's what will help child pass through this stage in a good way. Stage 5 is identity versus role confusion, adolescence time. If the child will be successful in making the transition from the impulsiveness of early childhood to the maturity of adulthood or young adulthood, adolescence, then the child will tend to be more responsible, purposeful and planned. He or she will develop confidence and will also experience else the child will kind of start experiencing role confusion. If the child has made this transition easily, has formed a proper identity because he has passed through earlier stages very well, then the child will have the sense of purpose about himself. If the parents and if the child has not really come up through this, then probably the child will experience a lot of problems. Now these are the stages of psychosocial development that were specified by Erikson, and I am sure you appreciate the kind of things. So that the kind of things that Erikson talks about, he talks about in reference to how important is the role of upbringing, how important is the role of parents and other social agents around the child to basically give the child a sense of identity, purpose, and a sense of happiness about growing up, and these kind of things. Now, there are other theories of social development as well. Say for example, Bandura's social cognitive theory basically emphasizes that there is a lot of importance of learning through observation. Children learn through observing other agents. They learn by imitating other agents. Also, they learn a lot about self-reward, in development of things like social skills, interactions, and behaviors. These are also kind of things that children are picking up. They will pick up a model and they will start doing whatever the model does. But the interesting thing is that children will basically be very attentive with respect to what kind of models they are picking up, whether the model actually has a successful background or not, whether whatever the model does gets rewarded or not. This is the kind of model organism that the child is has chosen, and is trying to align his behavior to the model, because the model is successful, the model gets rewards and is known and is praised in society. Also, children can just start sometimes blindly imitating, they could just say, for example, a father, mother, or an elder sibling. Children might also kind of end up just imitating without really having a bigger grasp of what imitation is leading to, because they don't really sometimes think that, okay, what is going to be the consequence of this. I'm just, I like this person, or this person is somebody close to me, and I'll just start imitating without really thinking about the consequences. Now, in all of this social development thing that we were talking about, there are two concepts which are very interesting, which are very important to remember. One of the concepts is vulnerability. Now, vulnerability basically refers to the psychological or environmental difficulties that make children, they bring children more at risk for developing later personality, behavioral, or social problems. Suppose if somebody is going through a very hard time, suppose say for example there are children who are being brought up in places like Syria or other places which are marred by violence. Those kind of things will have will definitely have impact on the children's development. They will put them at risk for developing social personality disorders. They will put children on the risk of developing mental disorders, psychological disorders, so on and so forth. So vulnerability is something very important, whether the child can actually go through all of these things and still develop into a healthy individual. That's something that is given a lot of importance. Another thing is very closely linked to is resiliency. Various traits, various characteristics of personality, family, and environmental factors that compensate for the increased life stresses, so that the expected problems do not develop. Suppose for example these children who are being raised in very difficult environments, what is the social structure that they have? What is the kind of social setting they have, whether the family is still together and they are still kind of holding out properly, they are still supporting the child, encouraging the child, telling the child that you have to bear these difficulties, later better times might come. These kind of things are linked to the child getting this resiliency, and these are the children who will probably bear these difficulties and kind of later develop into healthy individuals. Now, two other concepts are very important when you talk about social development. One is gender identity and the other is gender roles. Now, there are two different things. Gender identity basically refers to the individual's experience of being a male or a female. How do people react to you? What are the things that you can do as you are a male or a female? What is your experience of being a male or female? What are the things that naturally are coming to you? That's at the individual level, whether you feel like a male or a female, those kind of things. Gender roles, on the other hand, are traditional or stereotypical behaviors and attitudes and personality traits that parents or society, peers at large expect us to conform to, because we are male and female. We are either male or female, biologically. So these two are different things. Sometimes, now that concepts like homosexuality etc. are gaining their proper importance and acknowledgement in the society, one needs to really wonder about these things. Gender identity is something that is very personal, and gender roles are things that the society is expecting you to do. Part of developing in a social world, part of developing through the social things is also to keep a balance or a congruence between these two things. If there is not, if the congruence is not there, the happiness and the development socially is not going to be seamless, it's not going to be problem free. So a lot of times, and these things are important for other reasons. For example, a lot of times children do behave in particular ways because the society expects them to do. Suppose for example a girl wants to become an engineer, or a boy, let us say, wants to become a chef. It might just have that the child just feels like, I like cooking, I just want to go into the kitchen, look at my mother, help her do something, and in the process learn this extraordinary skill of cooking. But the gender roles are kind of not going to encourage him doing that. And if there is this conflict between what the person wants to do in his skin, in his identity, then there is going to be conflict, then there is going to be unhealthy development. This is not really going to work out so well. So this is again something, when you look at social development, you have to kind of take into account these things. The social role theory, which we can talk about. Now the social role theory basically emphasizes the influence of social and cognitive processes on how we interpret, organize and use information. So we look at the society also through a social lens. We look at society, say for example, if you apply this theory to gender roles, it says that mothers, fathers, teachers, grandparents, etc., they expect and respond to and reward different behaviors in boys and girls. And as I was saying, so the child who's just who's in biology is a boy or a girl, is just kind of reacting to, it's getting reinforced to commit certain kinds of behaviors because they are encouraged by the caregivers, because they are encouraged by immediate people around them. And a lot of times they start, say for example, stereotypes about female feticides, stereotypes about men not respecting women, stereotypes about men ogling girls, and those kind of things are things that kind of get reinforced at a very early level. The society has taught that females are lesser beings. You would have probably, people would have seen in their families that sisters are given less importance, brothers are given more importance, their work is to do household chores, and being a boy, my work is to do something else. These are the things that the society is imposing, and what happens is that these are the things that are kind of getting entrenched in the way the child is looking at the world. So he will probably at the end of the day not know any other way to look at information in a particular way. So he's not really developed that openness, he's not really developed that perspective that this is probably wrong and this should not be done, or there are other ways of living and behaving which are contrary to these kind of things. So this is something very important when you're talking about how social roles influence a person's development. Now finally there is this cognitive development theory. The cognitive development theory, again I am still talking about social development, it says that children develop mental skills and they interact with their environments in particular ways, and that they learn one set of rules for male behaviors and one set of rules for female behaviors. Again, just complementing this whole idea of gender identity and gender roles, it says that it's not only social roles that are being imposed, it's again, as I was saying, the cognitively you start understanding things as given. Cognitively you start understanding that this is a given. Okay, this is how a boy should behave, this is how a girl should behave, and this is a given. This is basically how my reasoning tells me that I should behave. Not really only social role, but mentally, cognitively, I have just started seeing the world in this, in these glasses. So all of these kind of things, things we've been talking about, Freud's psychosexual stages, or Erikson's psychosocial stages, or if you look at Bandura's social cognitive theory, all of these things kind of tell us that this is what I was referring to when I was talking about the nature versus nurture part. Nature part, biological development, etc., was one story. This is an entirely different story, and this is a story that is influenced and kind of affected a lot by starting from immediate caregivers, the parents, then to slightly larger families, relatives, etc., and then to the society at large. So this is basically what the nature and nurture question kind of leads us to. So this is all from me about development. We've talked about biological, social development, we've talked about cognitive development as well. In the next lecture onwards, I'll probably take one of the very important cases from the cognitive development profile. I'll talk to you about memory and stuff, and how memory develops during the lifespan of the individual. Thank you.